Clovis I founded the Kingdom of France by uniting all of the Frankish tribes under one crown, making him effectively the first king of what would eventually be France. Originally the king of a Frankish tribe known as the Salian Franks, Clovis was born into the pagan family and explored Arianism before being baptized into the Catholic Church later in life. His changes to the political system from one where each tribe had its own petty king to one where they were all ruled over by one great king. This homogenized the various tribes under a collection called the Frankish Kingdom, aka Francia, and ensured that the crown would be passed down to his descendants. Because of this, Clovis I is considered to be the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, which survived for over 200 years. This unification of tribes in the region that would eventually be known as France set a foundation for a large assembled community later on. Clovis eventually died in Paris and is now buried in the Saint Denis Basilica. It's incredible to think that French history goes so far back and is recorded well enough for us to know where the original king of France died, and his remains are still tended to this day. Hundreds of years later, Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great, jointly inherited the Frankish crown with his brother Carloman. Following the death of their father, Pepin III, the division of power over the kingdom made for a fierce rivalry between the brothers, and Charlemagne made as many alliances as he could to secure his position as ruler. However, when Carloman died unexpectedly in 771, Charlemagne was left as the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom. Frankish tradition dictated that the king of the Franks, Charlemagne, was a warrior king whose duty was to lead his troops to victory over other territories in the same way that his Merovingian predecessors had. Charlemagne's military skill was recognized by Pope Leo III when he crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800. In his position over most of Europe, Charlemagne was able to keep Christianity in the West alive, which is one of the top historical events with obvious long-lasting effects. Louis the Pious, which is Charlemagne's last surviving son, attempted to give his four sons varying degrees of power and influence in the Carthaginian Empire's territory. He gave the eldest the title of King of Italy / co-emperor of the empire. His second son was made King of Aquitaine, which is nowadays a French subdivision, and his third son was made King of Bavaria. When Louis the Pious tried to give his fourth son some power, the other three sons disagreed and resisted. They banded together to dethrone Louis the Pious, which they succeeded in doing, but the next year, Louis took the throne back, demoted these sons, and the power dynamics of the family and the landscape role changed multiple times in a short period, throwing the family and the empire into restlessness. Eventually, the family made amends enough to function for some time before falling back into their old ways. A 15th century painting of Louis the Pious blessing the division of the empire between his sons. When Louis the Pious finally died, one of the sons sought to claim his two remaining brothers' lands. In retaliation for his greed, the other two sons declared war on their brother and signed the Oath of Strasbourg, which made the war declaration official. Thankfully, the civil war didn't last long, and the very next year, the signing of the Treaty of Verdun brought an end to the Carthaginian Civil War. As a result, Charlemagne's empire was split into three sections: the Western Frankish realm, the Central Frankish realm, and the Eastern Frankish realm, aka West Francia, Central Francia, and East Francia, which were ruled by Charles the Bald, Lothair, and Louis the German, respectively. The signing of this treaty was particularly important as it laid the foundations for the modern-day European countries of France and Germany. The victories and hardships seen by the French nation are not only significant in the history of France, but in the history of Europe and the world. Louis VII developed medieval France in many pivotal ways. He was one of the leaders of the Second Crusade, having joined at the request of the Church to defend Christian territories. Although the campaign was a failure, it sure served to strengthen the connection between France and the Christian world, influencing the country's priorities. This was important since Louis VII had many instances of insulting the church during his realm. Louis was also known for two major social developments in Paris, founding both the University of Paris and the Notre Dame Cathedral. These developments helped reiterate Paris as one of the top cultural hotbeds at the time, a reputation that has obviously continued to the present day. Notably, he also highlighted the delicate balance between royal authority and the power of the church when he was granted an annulment in his marriage. The 100 Years' War is next. The war began in 1337 between the kingdoms of England and France, and was an on-and-off conflict for a total of about 116 years. During the war, 5 generations of kings from France and England fought for the French throne, which was then the dominant kingdom in Western Europe. The war had a lasting effect on European history. Both sides produced innovations in military technology and tactics, including professional standing armies and artillery, that permanently changed European warfare. King Louis XI was the king who brought an end to the Hundred Years' War with the signing of the Treaty of Picquigny in 1475. I definitely mispronounced that, which prevented a slow period following the French victory in Castillon from turning back into full-blown warfare. This treaty declared peace between England and France for a minimum of 7 years while they worked out the details of their relationship between the two kingdoms and how their territories and power could be divided. Throughout Louis XI's reign in France, he made some powerful advancements like limiting the power of nobles as a way to strengthen the crown, making the tax system more efficient, and building postal roads all across the kingdom for fast and efficient message relaying, earning him the nickname the Universal Spider. Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, reigned from 1643 to 1715. He's most notable for literally bringing France's royal and political centers under one roof at its home, the Palace of Versailles. Louis achieved this by first declaring himself as the divine ruler of the Kingdom of France following the death of Cardinal Mazarin, his chief minister. Though this move was strictly against French political and royal tradition, Louis was convicted of his divine right to rule over the kingdom as a dictator. During this time as a ruler of France, he sought to strengthen the monarchy and weaken the feudal nobles. Doing so would mean that the nobles wouldn't feel as though they were even close to the same amount of power as the crown, and they would not gather their own forces to possibly take on the monarchy in battle. Louis XIV created a culture of dependency on the crown by making it mandatory for the nobles to spend part of the year in Versailles, where they would be treated lavishly, and developed a sense of contentment, assuring they would not rebel against the king who treated them so well. He also was a warmonger. He had grown up during the Franco-Spanish War, and so he must have become accustomed to wartime life. He led France into 5 major conflicts over a 72-year reign, which changed the political and economic landscape of France and Europe each time. Now, about the French-Spanish War. The French history is incredibly vast, so I cannot go over everything. And since these series is supposed to be simplified history, rather than going over every single detail of every history, which is impossible, frankly impossible, I am leaving out a lot of things that France is involved in, like the Franco-Spanish War, because that's not as important to the actual history of the French state. So, just getting that out there. The French Revolution was one of, if not the most pivotal point in the history of France, due to the centralization of power by Louis XIV and the debts incurred by war, compounded by the following reign of Louis XV, who lost even more of the crown's money plus colonies in North America in the 7 Years' War, and followed by Louis XVI, whose poor economic strategy led to food scarcity and overtaxed common folk. The peasants decided to rebel. The French peasants became intolerant of the regime and became violent towards the monarchy, storming Versailles and attempting to assassinate the queen. A semblance of peace was established, and the angry mob left. However, the seeds of revolution had been planted and were beginning to sprout. On August 13th of 1792, the National Convention arrested Louis XVI and declared France to be a republic. Shortly after, Louis was tried and convicted of high treason and executed via the guillotine. He was followed by Marie and then many others in the Reign of Terror. That was the French Revolution. The future of France was irrevocably changed to go in an entirely new direction. The First Republic was established in 1792 and paved the way for Napoleon I to become Emperor of the French and go on to perform some other major events in French history. Bastille Day is celebrated on the 14th of July every year. It celebrates the storming of the Bastille, which signified the start of the Revolution. The Bastille was a fortress in Paris that served as a prison for those deemed disloyal to the monarchy. The storming mob, made up of about 1,000 peasants, hoped to find weapons to fight against the monarchy, as well as free any prisoners. The mob captured and eventually beheaded many of those posted to defend the Bastille. The Bastille was then dismantled brick by brick over the course of about 5 months. The drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Men and of the Citizens in 1789 marked a key point in the French Revolution when it was adopted by the National Constituent Assembly as part of the creation of the new French Constitution. The document is made up of 17 articles detailing the rights of men within the context of the New France. For instance, the Declaration calls for an end to feudalism and therefore to aristocratic powers over land and the people who work on it, as well as granting the French people sovereignty over the country. This declaration was used alongside the Magna Carta as inspiration for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. When Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself emperor in 1804, it was the start of a major reshaping of France and Europe as a whole. You can even include the world in that. One of his most enduring reforms was implementation of the Napoleonic Code in 1804, which defined concepts like civil law and property rights. He centralized the government, reorganized the education system, and modernized the tax system, increasing France's state power. His military conquest spread revolutionary ideas across Europe by virtue of introducing different groups of people to ideas like liberty. Through battle, he changed borders and introduced legal, military, and administrative reforms far and wide. For much of his reign, Napoleon was generally well-liked because he gave structure to France in a way that had been severely lacking in the Reign of Terror after the Revolution. He went on a rampage all across Europe, being close to taking over the continent. Well, not actually close, but he was setting the stages. And then he did a little Russian invasion, which didn't go so well. Eventually, Napoleon collapsed under the weight of his ego after betraying the ideals set by the revolution that gave him power in the first place. Napoleon's time as emperor is by far one of the most notable French historical events. Prussia and France were in tension over which country could lay claim to the recently empty Spanish throne. The Prussian and German forces united. Their artillery weapons were superior, and their numbers vastly outnumbered France's troops. The Prussian forces invaded the northeast section of France and handily defeated them, capturing the emperor and demoralizing the French. In response to his defeat, Parisians overthrew Napoleon III's government. The chaos in the city made it easy to capture. Within 24 hours, the Prussian troops surrounded Paris and took control of Versailles. Hundreds of thousands of French troops and civilians perished in the war. Even though German and Prussian troops also suffered many casualties, they fared much better. The victory in the war catapulted them to farther success. Germany emerged as a unified nation, helped by the spoils of the Franco-Prussian War, mostly the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine and the exorbitant monetary winnings. Germany's victory also stoked a deep resentment in the French people, leading to a domino effect of anger and destruction. World War I had a devastating impact on France. The country was one of the major players on the Western Front, and millions of French soldiers fought and died over the war's 4 years. Having perhaps just recovered from the fallout of the Franco-Prussian War, France again paid heavily with civilian casualties and a brutalized economy. Many troops were also left disfigured and or disabled through injury or psychological trauma. France's agriculture suffered as many of the farms and fields had been destroyed. The French people, along with others involved in World War I, experienced a collective trauma full of bombs, chemical weapon attacks, and trench warfare. Entire families were wiped out, and immigration surged as a way to replace the decimated population. It left the populace scarred and demoralized, and would inform their decisions regarding World War II. During World War II, the signing of an armistice between France and Germany in 1940, after Germany invading France and capturing Paris, divided France into two zones: the northern zone, which was occupied by German forces, and the unoccupied southern part of the country, known as the Free Zone. Although it seemed that the French state would try to carry on as normal, its leader had other ideas. They established a regime headquartered in the town of Vichy, with similar values to the Nazi regime in Germany. The leader's subsequent agreement to collaborate with Germany was met with protests, and the Vichy regime ended in 1944 when France was liberated by the Allies. The Fifth Republic is a system of government that was drafted by Charles de Gaulle and later approved by the French people in a referendum. This new government was formed in response to the failure of the Fourth Republic, which was weak due to the political instability within the government itself. The Algiers War of Independence further destabilized the Fourth Republic and eventually collapsed. This prompted de Gaulle to unretire from politics, help create the new republic, and become the new president. The key difference between the Fourth and the Fifth Republics is that the president was given more authority at the expense of the National Assembly, which is now the lower house of parliament. The relatively new foreign government, the France we know today, operates under the rules of the Fifth Republic, with Macron currently serving as its president. The events of May 1968 marked the lives of a generation of French students. The whole of the 60s saw a lot of political turmoil in France. Algeria declared independence in 1962. The Fifth Republic was still settling in and working out the snags. And the Vietnam War was inspiring young people all over the world to question leadership. With a significant growth in the number of young people attending university in France, students and workers remember that they had a voice in their own, just like their revolutionary ancestors, and they had a lot to say. Tired of a country preoccupied with old values of capitalism, imperialism, and traditionalism, members of the Communist and Socialist parties, along with far-left learning members of society, occupied an administration with a sign reading, "Factory occupied by the workers." There they held a meeting about class discrimination in French society and the political bureaucracy that controlled the university's funding. While this first protest event was dispelled without any violence or destruction, protests continued on at the campus, finally prompting the university administration to shut down the campus in May. More than 20,000 students, teachers, and supporters marched together to Sorbonne University to protest the closure of the campus. When protesters met the police, tensions rose, and eventually protesters began throwing rocks at the police, who responded with force, and hundreds of students were arrested. More and more student protests took place. Even high school students, teachers, and young workers began protesting the police. The imprisonment of the protesters and the closure of the university campus. On March 13th, over 1 million protesters marched through Paris, and although they met little police resistance, the damage had already been done from instances of police brutality in previous protests. Students occupied the university and inspired over 400 action committees to be set up in Paris and elsewhere to take up grievances against the government and French society. The protests spread to encompass workers all across sectors of the economy, and up to a third of all French workers began striking, requesting higher wages and more workers' rights. Feeling pressure from the Communist Government Party, which was calling for a revolution and a new government, then President Charles de Gaulle fled the country on May 29th and went missing from the world for about 6 hours, and the government effectively halted. On May the 30th, 400,000 to 500,000 protesters marched through Paris, calling for de Gaulle's resignation. That evening, de Gaulle announced a special election to be held on June 23rd, and the protesting crowd was satisfied. A full-blown Second French Revolution was avoided, much to the relief of the necks of all the government officials. May of 1968 is remembered as a demonstration of anti-authoritarianism and the rejection of conservative values in France. The euro was introduced in 1999 and was gradually rolled out for practical use in the European Union. On January 1st of 2002, France, along with 11 other countries, officially introduced the euro, banknotes and coins, replacing the franc, which has been France's currency since 1795. The franc stopped being accepted as currency in 2002 after the tradition period ended. The logistics behind the switch were massive, involving careful coordination between banks, ATMs, retailers, and cash machines across the country. Moving to a common currency within the EU helps France feel more connected and integrated with their brethren nations. That is all of the French history I'm going to be going over. Of course, they joined NATO, left NATO, joined back into NATO. There's many wars like the Crimean War back in the days, the War of the Spanish Succession, more of the attacks on like Jerusalem that France was heavily involved in. There's like the Haitian War, the Berlin Conference dividing up Africa and such. But I didn't want this video to be 30 minutes long. So that's it for the French history. Now for some fun fact. The first fun fact is that France is the most visited country in the world with about 100 million tourists in 2026. The second is that France shares its highest mountain in Western Europe, Mount Blanc, with Italy, not Germany. Number 3 is that France has the most time zones in the world, with 12 distinct time zones. The fourth is that France is the biggest country by area in the European Union, even bigger than Sweden and Spain. And 5 is that Paris is not the city with the most French speakers in the world. Instead, Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo has more French speakers. Anyways, that is it for the simplified history of France.